Um, all right, we are.
It's on the air.
It's on the air. We're live. Yeah, hello everybody. Welcome. This is the inaugural episode of General Conversations. I'm your host and conversationalist, Evan Fusco, and today I am joined by Jesse Malmed, who is an artist, curator, and educator working in video, performance, text, installation, events, occasional objects, merch, their gaps, overlaps, Chicago and Milwaukee. His work plays in sub and countercultural histories, like a joke that's a poem that's a song covering itself, a shadow puppet interfering in the broadcast beam, having deja vu for the first time, or watching a time travel sequence in reverse. I sure hope a shadow puppet interferes with this broadcast. That would be great. Jesse Malmed, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so excited to be the first guest.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd want to add before I kind of jump into that first question I want to ask?
No.
Cool. Well, as first guest, I was saying to you earlier, and I think it's kind of the beautiful serendipity of this. My first and only time I've been interviewed for a radio show was for Bad at Sports, and you were the one who primarily interviewed me. And so this is, a great thing. But it also means that I know you're going to have something interesting to say about my first question, which, right, this is a show about conversation. It's conversation, right? It's something I'm constantly thinking about. And I wonder what thoughts you have on conversation as a format, conversation as something that happens, and conversation is something that maybe we should be more attuned to, or maybe less attuned to, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something really interesting and fascinating about the sort of like the distinction between the interview and the conversation, especially in sort of like mediated forms, radio, podcast, whatever, and just like the sort of freedom that allows, and also the way that it doesn't have to become definitive, or it takes the pressure off, or it shifts the pressure for everybody involved, that it is something that is similar to how we might be talking, but also there is the built-in sense that there is an audience somewhere, and that might be in the future.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting thing to think about, not to get hung up on, but just the way that the rare occasions of something that then like persists beyond the moment of it happening, and what are the microphones and the headphones and things like that, the different like technologies, but also like aesthetics that change that a little bit and shift it into something that's almost future thinking.
Yeah.
Which I think is really, I don't know. And the conversation is great because it's just like, it's mutually, it's like, I mean, we were talking before we went on air about D&D, and I think about sort of, I don't know, like some sense of like a conversation as a language game that also functions as like a collaborative world building or something.
Yeah.
That feels distinct from a questionnaire or me reciting a press release or something like that,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, conversation is such a, there's something funny like in that kind of thing of D&D, right? For so many first-time people playing D&D, conversation becomes the scariest part of it, the kind of role play of it. And so it's almost as if mediated versions of conversation, there's almost like more stakes, or there's more worry, the recording of it. But I think I'm really interested in that moment where even, we have the microphones, we have this, there are cameras in here recording us, and it's like, how do we step beyond that and almost try to have something conversational despite the maybe 3 people that are listening live to this right now. Yeah. Well, I guess, with that, I often think of conversation as a base, but for you and, your practice, which is the kind of the more general thing I would like to talk about today, having you here in the studio. I wanted to start with, when I was writing down my notes, I referred to it as you have your hands in many honey pots. And I think maybe that's just a condition of me having watched too much Winnie the Pooh when I was little. But just this kind of, you are somebody who does so many different things, so many different ways of making. I mean, you move between 2 cities, right? Which we can talk about later, because you've argued it's basically the same city almost. But what is it? What is that thing that draws you to that way of being an artist, to have yourself doing so many things, right? Merch, video, karaoke, writing, lecture performance, and after that kind of explanation, also how do you manage that kind of working in so many modalities?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with the second part and say that I manage it not particularly well. In terms of like, especially when using the term manage, like the sort of managerial part of it is something that is an endless struggle. I feel like I start many emails with "I'm really sorry," but that also is, I don't know. Hopefully, that's allowed. I mean, it really. I don't know. Like it comes naturally to me. The way that my brain works is that it's like there's a lot of different ideas happening simultaneously, and so I think that at some point the realization that instead of trying to cram all these ideas into a singular practice or a singular medium or something like that, it was much more generative and exciting, and also like offered more to the ideas if I could find like the right container for them, and also allow for something to move back and forth. And so I'm also not opposed to, like, a good line shows up in a press release for a screening as it does inside of a poem or something. Like I feel like that sort of almost like auto sampling or something like that is kind of interesting and feels like it pushes against some version of an interdisciplinary practice that still holds on to a modernist sense of like finding the right medium for it or an articulation of the medium. So that's to say that like these things combine in hopefully interesting ways, and they I also find like that when I don't know, having multiple things happening simultaneously allows for like when I'm not in the mood to do something else becomes like the procrastinatory output or whatever is, instead of watching TV or something like that, though I do that too, is like, okay, then a new idea showed up, or I'm like drawing when I'm like avoiding an email and when I'm trying to think of something else, or sometimes these things move into one another and while doing something have an idea for something else. And it also just like allows me to, I don't know, get to experience a lot of different spaces. I feel like there can be a challenge sometimes for an artist of like siloing oneself, and I'm really happy to be able to like participate in zine fairs and in film festivals and in performance spaces and all these different kinds of things as a way of I don't know, crossing those boundaries and seeing like, and also I think there's something really interesting about like, I mean, this is something you're invested in also, but like what happens when something more, I don't know, lecture-y, something languagey happens in a music space? What happens when something musical happens in a film space? What happens when something, I don't know, it's just like moving those things around, I think, can like offer a new context for them that actually opens something up about the work.
Yeah, and I mean, right, we are currently seated within the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a school that, especially in its undergrad program, kind of prides that interdisciplinary nature. And, there are limitations to that here, of course. Like, you don't want somebody who doesn't know what they're doing going in and operating a kiln, for example.
Right.
But, I wonder, in thinking of the interdisciplinary, is there, especially because oftentimes when, like you said, I am somebody who understands that, like the kind of way that an almost kind of, an interdisciplinariness also allows for a kind of amateurishness to kind of come in a way that is
for sure
opening to the mediums, and like how is it that you approach then, like, and maybe it hasn't happened in a while, but like you kind of are like, oh, this is the medium for this. I've never done that before. Like, how do you start to step into those spaces, and how do you kind of start to manage that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that the way you're describing, I mean, the sort of amateurishness, I think, is actually really important. I think that there's a distinction between that, which feels like a sort of, allowing for like the beginner's mind to show up in a place and maybe think about things in a way that someone who is deeply entrenched is not able to. And then also, of course, amateur comes from the idea of to love, and I feel like to kind of like love the idea of the thing and then figure it out. I think sometimes about, the sort of idea of like no knowledge before need as a sort of art concept of like that the point at which you're making something that is more materially invested in some other thing, that's the point at which you need to learn that thing. And it's not that I only believe in that. I also know from my own practice that like being in the midst of something does generate ideas. And I don't know, I mean, ceramics is something that I dabbled in at the smallest level, but you said kiln, so I feel like that's a good one of being like, there is a way that I, like can have shown up with clay and had no idea, and then in like pushing things around and moving things around and seeing the way that you're supposed to do things from even the most beginner level, an idea can emerge that wouldn't have come out otherwise. That is maybe less conceptual and sort of like, okay, it's like it's a rock made out of clay or whatever. Like there's, which I'm also into, but like the version of, okay, once you're inside of it, then all of a sudden these like new forms can emerge. So in terms of like learning new technologies or techniques or something like that, it's something that I'm really open to and excited by, but also am kind of like perpetually, even the things that I'm maybe best at, I'm still kind of aware that there's a lot I can learn, and I'm just trying to like figure it out while I'm doing it and not get bogged down, and kind of like allow for the idea to articulate itself, but also allow for like what seem to be the conditions of that process to inform the things I'm doing, both in a way that can be towards the goal that might seem most obvious, but also like towards a kind of messiness or amateurishness that can emerge from that. That like potentially somebody who doesn't know how to draw in the most kind of like typical sense can actually make more interesting marks than somebody who can properly depict any scene, you know?
Absolutely. And I mean, it is funny you say the make a rock out of glass. It's like that is the big thing I did when I took a ceramics class in grad school.
Yeah, because it's like, this is such a good idea.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, you just get a nice, and it's like you learn just enough that you're like, oh, this is how I get it so that the clay can be fired solid.
Yeah.
And then it's just, just wedge the clay and it becomes a rock when you fire it. But I, to your point, right, there is, it's funny, ceramics is just the perfect kind of space because there's so much technical knowledge and so many of these things. But that kind of, what you brought up was like kind of learning from, and is there, right, when you have so many hands and so many different pots and you're kind of doing all these things, right, there is a certain amount where who you're working with becomes really important. And so I wonder for you, is like collaboration then become a really important part of being able to make in the way that you do, or how often are you working with people and things like that?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I'm actually on Tuesday, so we're recording on Thursday. On Tuesday in Milwaukee, I've organized a screening that's called Co that's all about collaborative filmmaking practices, and part of the idea with that is that I'm working inside of a film department that has a strong experimental edge. Is that there's like this tension between that often the way that an artist is conceived of, or like art school, whatever, is sort of like towards the individual, and then in sort of more like conventional mainstream dominant filmmaking, it is collaborative and that many people are working on it, but that it's like highly sequestered, highly hierarchical, and to learn the codes of like the props person never touches that kind of stuff, which to me feels really limiting at best. I've sort of other words to use, but I'll stay with that one. Anyways, so trying to like figure out like what are other ways people have made use of this, so including people that sort of treat it like a band, or people that are working back and forth and working separately and then combining the things, or what are the various ways that can happen. Anyways, so just to say that it's sort of like top of mind right now, as it often is. But yeah, I mean, I love being able to work with people in different ways, and sometimes it is a thing. Like there's a piece that is connected to the thing that I did with General Ideas performance, this performance that I did in a couple different forms that was the same text on different index cards, shuffled right before each of the performances, so each one was distinct but also the same, like modules, and then created different sort of like sets of interruptions for each one. So one of the ones happened at the lawn, and as part of that, I like made some pies, and they were thrown in my face at different times, and that was a thrilling interruption. And then for the one that I did with you, I had these like tape players that I was both like recording on 3 different ones and then playing things back simultaneously and then rewinding. And so there's like thinking about these different kind of interruptive modes. Anyway, but so for one of them also that happened at Watershed, I had my friends Ben Balcom and Sam Drake come, and they were shooting on 16 millimeter single roll. So it was something where it was like 3 minutes for a 20-minute performance of footage. And then Ben had a boom mic and was being sort of interruptive, aggressive, performing inside of the space. So it was sort of like so highlighting, first of all, sort of like documentation as something that is a part of the piece. Also trying to think about that as something that could become something else afterwards in a way that is not just like a static video shot from behind, which is kind of less interesting to watch maybe, or something that doesn't exist, doesn't maybe transcend into like becoming its own thing. It becomes documentation. anyways, so that was like one of those moments where it's like that collaboration was based on two people who are both very good at what they do, in the sense trusting them and their expertise, giving some direction, but also like really wanting them to like do the thing that they want to do and then hand it off to me. So that kind of collaboration I love, but also I love the kind of collaboration of like almost like the writer's room approach, where it's people getting together and sort of like ideating.
Yeah.
And so I think just sort of like complicating the idea of specifying the idea of collaboration and what we want out of a moment. And sometimes that's like someone to come in, like I feel like I use music metaphors a lot, but like a side person to come in and like play on this thing, and it's like their work but it fits inside of this thing, versus something where it's like you're writing the thing together, or also the various ways the collaboration can function like as a sort of like nestled authorship. So for like Western Pole, that project, or some of the other sort of curatorial things that I'm doing, thinking about how like that's something that is both my project and that person is doing it in that moment. And then so it's sort of like an artist curatorial move where we're both sort of making the thing together, almost like the curator can be sometimes more like a platformist who just brings the thing up that the person has made, and at other times almost thinking like as an editor or a producer in terms of like helping like massage the thing into the thing that makes sense for that context.
Yeah.
And still it's like that person's work, but like of course conversation is the way that those things get more interesting than just sort of like dropping off the thing and then you figuring out where to put it.
Yeah. Well, and with the music thing, I think of I've been thinking about this for years now, ever since Hanif Abdurraqib's A Little Devil in America came out, and the essay in it called I Want to Give Mary Clayton Her Flowers, where he talks about the kind of event, essentially, right, of the Rolling Stones kind of bringing in Mary Clayton like at midnight in her pajamas, like 8 months pregnant, and if anybody's interested in this in any way, it was for Gimme Shelter. Highly recommend just read Hanif Abdurraqib's essay, but the kind of in particular thing, there's this moment in Gimme Shelter that when you listen closely, it's like her voice breaks, and it's this moment of, it's the accident of it, right? The accident of this moment that gives that song, it's like apathesis or whatever. I can never remember how that's word said, but like this kind of moment, right? And it's in the breakdown of the human voice that kind of interesting thing happens, and in this very explicit collaboration, that for many, probably, there are probably many people who don't know that that's like Mary Clayton on that album necessarily, unless you're looking at the liner notes. And I'm thinking about that in relation to what you're talking about of collaboration as these kinds of, in some rate, collaboration is this funny thing where to work with other people, there is a difficulty to that. And it's interesting to me that for you, it's in that interruption, it's like harnessing that difficulty and not seeing it as a failure, but as the very reality of that kind of process, that is the byproduct you want from collaboration, is the interruptions. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about that, especially with this kind of, what I'm seeing is like a real big trend with a lot of what you're talking about and a lot of the work is this like the gamification or the randomization or the kind of reality of iteration, like whether it be in the lecture performance you were talking about with the interruptions, or the karaoke pieces you've been doing, or even the kind of ways that your curatorial project with the Western Pole, weather comes in there, and I'm wondering how do you think about these things as like this, maybe almost like that is a kind of main medium, almost like these contingency almost.
Totally. Contingency is an important part of it. And I think also, I think often in terms of, well, both with collaboration, but also let's think about sort of like participatory works, like the karaoke, I think is a good example of that, where it's like, I think often that there can be a sense, this is the same with collaboration, that sometimes there can be a sense from the outside that it's kind of like an all or nothing thing, as opposed to it being a spectrum, where it's like every work of art is participatory and that like the painting doesn't have meaning until the person looks at it, etc. So that's like one version that is the given, fantastic music, whatever. But then also ones where it's sort of like, one can be asking maybe too much of the participant, like the kind of, I don't know, sort of like prototypical first participatory thing where it's sort of like a blank piece of paper and being like, draw what you want, and then people just like they write their name and they draw anime characters and they draw, whatever the sort of
genitalia.
The usual genitalia. I was like, yeah, what is that? Are you allowed to? Is that?
I think we can
swear
say
in Latin. You can say genitalia. Yeah. But like you know exactly where I was going. And versions of that where it's sort of like, okay, so that maybe wasn't enough instruction, and then too much instruction, and it's sort of a thing where it doesn't have space for the person to provide much, And so thinking about sort of like what are the ways where you can create enough of a space where someone is able to do something that feels interesting to them, but also has enough guidance that they don't feel, put upon, that they don't have the version of sort of like being at a show and like someone's doing crowd work and being like, oh my God, don't talk to me. Like there is a way that, like there is responsibility for the magician, the comedian, the artist to also like, people went because you're the person doing it. So like allowing like what is the right amount for a person to be able to do that, and what is the way for that to be sort of joyful and interesting. And I feel like, karaoke is an interesting version because it's like, it's extremely, it tells you exactly what to do, but also it opens up, you can actually do whatever you want in the middle of that. Like the microphone is yours. You can decide if you're going to try to do it in your style and their style in between. People could tell jokes, they could do magic when they're up there. Yeah. And that's rare, but that is like a thing that I think is, so just like the sort of like the terms of that and how to do that in a way that doesn't necessarily become too regimented, I think is kind of, because also like you want it to have enough air inside of it for the other people to be involved, but also for it to be interesting for you as the person who's like making the proposal, let's say.
Yeah.
So opening that or like allowing for that, I think is a really curious thing, and also how to articulate your desires inside of collaboration or participatory work in a way that is clear but also elegant, or feels sort of, I don't know. Yeah, I like you don't want to have the whole thing described in terms of what a person should do. So it's like how to give cues. And in general, people like have a pretty good sense of how to do a lot of things and how to take the invitation, because we're doing that all day long. And so then in terms of like contingency, I think that also, honestly, it's just like it's in part it's a way for like the work to stay alive, and like you have this idea, and then once other things show up, it starts to become something that is dynamic in the midst of it happening. And so for me, that like whatever, both like shuffling the cards but also having other things happen simultaneously allows for it to be a thing where I have to be like present in a way that is also not like I'm pressing play on myself, but I'm also present to the things that are happening. And that is just like a really exciting place to be inside of that level of like paying attention, but also being sort of like a vessel for the work to go through, which especially with like performance is like one of the sort of ideal states that I just like want to be inside of. And teaching often feels that way, which is part of why I love it, is that it's like at its best, it's a thing where it feels like this sort of like dynamic organism conversationally that's shifting. This person said this, that reminds me of something else. Do we have time to look at this? Bringing up an artwork that I wouldn't have otherwise thought to bring into the room that day, but all of a sudden is like the perfect thing that might change somebody's life, and somebody else is just like, wait, what? And that's also valid, and maybe that shows up again in their life, and maybe not, and that's like,
Yeah, it feels very, right, that's the kind of spirit of conversation maybe versus interview, to kind of think back to, where it's like, an interview, it's like you're trying to get sound bites, you're trying to get stuff out of it, right? Like there's a goal, and there's not always something wrong with that, but I think of like, who is it, Jon Stewart, or whenever he does the interviews, he like asks the first question and then immediately rips up all of the cards, right? And it's that kind of thing of, there's something really beautiful about responding, right? Like acting, some of the best videos I've seen on people talking about acting is how much it's about listening. And the thing that I like about conversations, and especially this kind of context, is that being able to sit, even though I'm trying to manage the time, right, still being able to sit and being like, no, I'm going to listen to you and not just think about the next thing that's going to be said. That feels so like valuable to me, right? Like that kind of deep joy.
Also, when people feel listened to, then they speak more interestingly and more honestly and more openly than if it's sort of like, okay, now you have 7 seconds to say your thing and I'm moving on. And it's sort of like, I could say anything, it doesn't matter, but it's sort of like, what can we build on? Instead of your tag or the genitalia, it's sort of like some prompt that allows the next person to do something. It like offers a really different approach.
Yeah.
Or like responsiveness also. Like also the difference between like a, you know, like a dive bar bathroom where like tags are referring to each other and someone's pointing over here and being like, "Wah, wah," and then like iterating on the joke in a sort of almost like the meme iteration is very different than, I don't know, looking at advertisements or something like that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanna kind of go back to a little bit to the iterative lecture performances and the way, like the kind of shuffling, and maybe in a kind of a way to dig into that. If you maybe, so you've kind of described it a little bit, but so, you know, if you want to kind of explain it a little bit more, for those who don't really
Yeah,
know.
totally. So I'll say that the titles for each one, which I don't have on hand, and they're all kind of confounding, but it's like my accelerated diner tune, my something something, but it's all my something tune.
Yeah.
And those are all anagrams of notes on indeterminacy, which it is both like a John Cage thing, but also something that I just think is an interesting maybe framework for these things. And I love the idea that then my and tune showed up so immediately when kind of like jumbling the letters. And yeah, and so for each of those, it's a series of different, you know, like there's poems that are, they're straightforwardly kind of more poems, and there's also things that are maybe closer to jokes and things that kind of like move between those, and things that are really straightforwardly, I mean, in as far as I'm ever kind of straightforward, anecdotes that kind of like are about ideas of indeterminacy, describing going to a screening of these short films, and there was a band practicing next door, and the ways that became the soundtrack for the show, and the band didn't know, and that kind of like aleatory approach, and different versions of people even, you know, describing to me other things that function like that, of like the interruptive thing, the siren lights outside of the opening, that then all of a sudden like the paintings become something where like blue and red is flashing on them, and that becomes this really kind of interesting moment. So there's something also connected maybe to like lore inside of there or something, or the ways that indeterminacy allows for a moment to be specific and feel like the kind of like, this was the one time this would ever be like this, and it could never be like that again, and the people in the room share that. You know, so it's just a series of different texts. Some are shorter, some are longer. They're shuffled, and then part of what's also I think kind of interesting about it for me is that, included in that is like the title page, and then a few different ones that talk about sort of like where we are inside of it. So if it were to be read in this sort of like an initial version of it, things about the beginning are talked about at the beginning, and things at the end, you know. But then there's something I think could be quite thrilling about just like, as I'm also doing it, being like, okay, there's only like 4 left, and being like, oh my god, this is so wild that like this one about "and now let's begin" is the last one. Like that, I couldn't, if I'd planned that, you know, it's like, it's a good bit maybe, but it's like, it's so much better that I wasn't the one who decided that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, lecture performances, I mean, as you know, I am obsessed with them completely. You know, I would argue that this radio show is a kind of lecture performance. Mm-hmm. But you kind of brought up, it's like there's some jokes in there, there's some poems, and like, you know, it's interesting, like, right, it kind of starts in the lecture, which is this kind of historically contingent space of like what that origin is usually not what people are thinking of, right? Mm-hmm. Like when they think of lecture, it's like they think of already falling asleep and like their teacher talking too long. But there's such this relationship to poetry and comedy and the essay and you know, the note cards, right? Mary Capello talks a lot about like notes in relation to the lecture. And I'm also thinking of most of the collections of lectures or small lecture books that I've ever gotten. It's like all poets, right? Like Mary Ruefle is the poet lecturer.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering for you, like, right, because lecture performances are so much about knowledge construction and like the form that it takes, but is there something for you in this piece in particular that, right, on top of the indeterminacy, like having it be that it's not just one form, but really being like, no, I also want there to be comedy in here. I want there to be poetry in here. I want there to be explanation in here, right? Something more didactic, right? Is there something for you that when these things come together, like what for you happens when these things come together, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think about it in a couple different ways. I mean, part of it has to do with also like how the audience responds to things, and I'm just like very aware of like, I don't know, a version of the exact same line that in a comedy context there's an expectation that ends with a laugh, and in a poetry context there's a, I don't know, the expectation that ends with a or sometimes people laugh and like that can feel interesting, but also like in some ways like the laugh is easier in a poetry context, and in some cases it's harder just because of how sort of people are primed for it. And so I'm just like very excited by the ways that these things can function differently, and how you can sort of like modulate the affect a little bit inside the room by deciding in that moment with different things. And this happens more in a place that is like where it's open and not confrontational, right? So it's like reading poems at a, or doing something more like performance-y, whatever we mean by that, in a comedy situation can be really interesting, but also could maybe like it begins with a sort of antagonism, and that can be like totally valid and interesting, but also maybe is not like, maybe there might be something more interesting about something that like sneaks up on a person instead of feeling like it is obfuscating it or something like that. And so just sort of like, what do all these things do when they're together? I don't know. Like I think they bounce against each other in interesting ways, and that's part of also what happens as they're shuffled. But it's like a bit of information that feels more didactic or something like that, or something that feels more anecdotal or something like that, than that like, you know, an anecdote can be delivered in a way that feels like a poem, or like a story, or I mean, most often like a story, or like a joke, or like it's something that you read somewhere or something like that. And then also borrowing text from other places can do the same thing of sort of like the collage allows for, you know, I think about it in terms of like, you know, like film editing in particular, but it could be anything that's time-based, but the sort of like the way that shot one plus shot two equals whatever you want it to be, and it's in the space between those two things, and the juxtaposition of that also like changes how you thought about the thing that just happened based on what happens right after that. And so to be able to like retroactively shift the understanding someone had of something from a minute ago because of the next thing, I think is really curious. And similarly, I think there's something inside of improvisation where it's like you can build rhythm through understanding when something has happened, you decide if that recurs or if that comes back as like a leitmotif or something like that, even if the way that it was originated came out of seemingly nowhere. So I think there's something really kind of exciting about that moment, and it can be interesting or exciting for both like the person doing it and for the audience of like watching something be built. I think is really, I mean, for me, it's like that's like my. I had this thing years ago where I was like, I mean, like a lifetime music obsessive, and that's been a big. I'm not a musician, but it's where I've spent a lot of my time, where I kind of come from. And I was having this like crisis of like, I don't know, I just like didn't care about music for a while, and it was this odd thing. And then I went to a show of the great, you know, avant-garde jazz, whatever, drummer Hamid Drake. And he was playing at the Hideout, and I just remember like watching thinking happening and seeing the way that as he's doing something, he all of a sudden is like coming upon, and this person is, I mean, no one knows more about, well, himself, but also drumming, and just being like, and then somehow something surprising happens, and then being like, okay, this now is going to happen a minute later, and this thing is building into this thing. And now there's like a kind of like a compositional arc that is occurring, but that 1 minute before the show started didn't know what was going to happen. And that's sort of like, I have this really strong memory, like watching him do it to us and watching the magic trick unfurl that kind of, brought me back. Not that I was ever that far away, I was being very dramatic, but there is something about like being in the presence of something that feels like, watching a thing happen. And also that happening in real time is different from like that same thrill of knowing about somebody's process and knowing that this is the product of thinking and doing and making and experimenting is still an important part of experiencing art, but something that's happening right in front of you as you're watching it, and you're sharing the same exact time and space and like time signature, and that watching what they're doing inside of that 2 minutes, I think is really life-giving.
I mean, it's that there's just something about that kind of like, that third thing that gets created, like you mentioned before, like the third thing between the artist and the paint, or not the artist, the viewer and the painting, or two paintings next to each other, or, I mean, in any two things coming together, right, there's that kind of magical third thing that happens between, whether it be shots or your note cards that get jumbled up, you know. And I was imagining like what happens when you're so in the zone of something more poetic that you move into the next card so fluidly that you accidentally read a joke like a poem. You know, and, you know, I'm thinking of this kind of, like the improv and this antagonism in particular, right? So I'm subscribed to this streaming service Dropout, and they just started a show called Crowd Control. That's a comedy show. It's like a kind of competition thing entirely built on crowd work. And the thing that crowd work and the thing that improv, I think, have in common is there's this kind of antagonism, right? Like, nobody wants to know someone who does improv, like, because and nobody loves being a part of crowd work, or more and more people do, but what's
historically, people have been afraid, instead of now being like, my turn, I have the craziest job.
Yeah. But what's so funny about the Crowd Control is that it is a kind of improv, but it's also, in this show, everybody's there because they're a part of it, and they have shirts where they like, it's like, oh, like, ask me about like this thing, and it'll be this like crazy shit. And it's so interesting how different it feels from like the videos you see, because you're seeing this genuine exchange happening, conversation again. And it's so funny. But I'm thinking about that in relation to the antagonism, and how it's not that there isn't some amount of antagonism still there, but it's a kind of like, you know, the poking and prodding, you know, the kind of like, you make fun of your friend because you love them kind of antagonism.
Yeah, totally.
And I was thinking about that in relation to like, and so especially with improv, where it's like, you know, improv that is concerned with being impressive in its declaration of like, oh, look what we came up with, is so, right? But there's so much great, I mean, we were talking, like, you know, we've brought up D&D a couple times, and like, that's all improv, and, you know, it's long form improv, and there's so many great improv people kind of coming up now with Dropout, but also like more and more. One of them just got onto SNL. And I think, you know, that kind of building, right? Improv is a building together. And I think, you know, I'm thinking about that in relation to what you're talking about. And this kind of like inanimate, like, partner of the improv, of like the interruption. Like, you have the people, but then also, the cards and these kinds of, the randomization and all of this. And I'm wondering if, like, I'm trying to figure out how to make it into a question. I might not be able to, if you have thoughts, but.
Well, one thing I'm thinking about that is something I think about in terms of like, like you know, improvisation is something that is like collaboration is something that's actually, you know, it's you know, it's really the dominant mode of a lot of art making. Like most music is built out of that, and whether that's something that is more ritualized, or the blues, or freestyling, or whatever the versions of that are, that is like, you know, most music historically, most notes that have been played in an improvisational setting. And then also thinking about like like Second City, or like that style of comedy improv, and the ways that also like how many of those things are things where there is a freedom inside of it, but actually like the structure is there, and it's like people who know how to play in whatever form know how to do that thing. And so it is a thing where it's like, you know, people who are jazz students up the block, it's like they know that, okay, my solo is coming, I have 2 bars to do this, and it's going to go this, and we know it's going to end, and then this person goes and this person goes. And so in a way that it's like that's a code as much as if it was written down, like that level of improvisation is something where it's still, there's a lot of joy inside of it and a lot of potential, but it is still like quite regimented. And then versions of something that is like so free that it's kind of like difficult for people to kind of like get a handle on what is actually happening. So I think about those kind of things also, of like, what is the like the version of crowd work that is also sort of like, I don't know, like, where are you from? You're like, Cleveland's terrible, and they like joke about Cleveland and being like, okay, so like they could have said any place, and you would have said,
this place is terrible.
Yeah, and like one local thing about the cuisine or about the traffic, but ultimately it's not sort of like offering something that genuinely surprises the person. They're sort of like waiting for that next thing or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's curious, and not, you know, that there's also value inside of that, but just like what that seems like another place where it's sort of like the the spectrum of that, and like, are there ways to sort of like destabilize that slightly? What happens if in that 2-bar solo or whatever, it somehow changes the time that people are experiencing, or all of a sudden like the song is totally different as opposed to just sort of like almost like Mad Lib's version of adjective solo whatever inside of there.
Yeah.
I don't know, and again, like, yeah, they're not towards any sort of hierarchy of these things, but I find myself excited by something that is like one step more unstable.
Yeah.
Also because it does feel, I don't know, just like a little, like the stakes are different because it's a little scary. Also, the stakes are different because like the expectation of something where we don't know what's going to happen are like, that was interesting, and that can be enough in a way that you wouldn't want that out of a show that you spent $60 to go to, of a band being like, I would like you to play some of the songs. Like, I know you know them,
Yeah.
like I did,
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things. I wonder, and maybe it's improv has always kind of been living around, and I'm seeing a lot of it. It feels like a kind of interesting way to think about with your work, but like if it's like in the zeitgeist or something, because it's like, right, like, the D&D actual plays where it is just like live long form improv gamified just through like dice, through Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they did a live show that sold out Madison Square Garden.
Whoa.
Right, like, and that kind of storytelling, that kind of almost like there's like like watching people react to things, and like it's almost like there's even though when you're doing improv, like, you can still lie, some of it's made up, right? Storytelling, it's this, it's that. There's shifts, or like even antagonism. I wonder if maybe there's almost something, it's like in its authenticity of like, you may be making up a story, you may be playing a character in this improv thing, but you're still responding in some amount of way honestly
Mm-hmm.
to what you're hearing, if maybe there's something in that is like extra appealing right now.
Yeah, and I think there's also something about like, right, the good faith collaborative approach to group improv or something like that is like, because like, I mean, we said Madison Square Garden, I was immediately thinking about like basketball, and like,
Yeah.
that is like a funny way to let somebody who feels squeamish about improvisation or freedom remember that, like, basketball is improvised. Like, there
Yeah.
are these like structures, but it's like, it is different every night, even though it's often very similar. But it's like, here's the structure, 24 seconds to do this, here's the ball. But like, no one could predict what the next thing's going to happen. Everybody's being totally responsive. So compared to other kinds of choreography, basketball compared to ballet is something where it's like so free,
Yeah.
even as like the structures are really there. And I don't know culturally like what that is. I mean, my personal sense would maybe be that it can feel difficult to feel, for some people, I think in this moment, to feel kind of like a level of agency or freedom, thinking about sort of like the ways that a student in a certain kind of school is like logging onto Canvas to understand what it is they need to do, and it being sort of like tasks that are rubriced, and just like how little joy there is inside of that compared to like opening up a text and trying to figure out what is going on in here.
Yeah.
And sort of like the difference between make a work and being like, it should be 36 by 48 and it should include these 7 techniques, or it should be 3 minutes long and we need to make sure there's 3 kinds of shots, and being like, you just are thinking about it very differently. And so in my mind, and maybe it's just, because I spend a lot of time with students who sometimes feel very sort of like, I don't know, stuck or something like that, or no, it's not stuck, but like that wanting to be able to perform well inside of a structure that is asking them to do specific things, as opposed to the idea of like breaking any of those rules would be more interesting than following the exact ones.
100%.
So that would be my sort of sense, is that there's enough safety inside of those structures that a person can kind of like do an interesting thing and know that it didn't break
Yeah.
D&D, the thing you just did.
Yeah. And it's, I think when the rules get broken and you do these things and you try new things, when everyone is doing it together, there's something really beautiful in that. There is always someone to kind of catch you.
Yeah.
And that's not always, doesn't always feel like it. And I think, it's always important to remember that the thing that binds us all together as people in educational contexts is that Canvas feels bad.
Right.
And that's across all institutions.
Yeah.
I guess before we kind of get on the off ramp into some segments or kind of questions that I want to ask specifically, there was one last thing I had written down, and it's small gestures.
Mm-hmm.
And that was another thing that I found, and I'm a big fan of like the small gesture
Mm-hmm.
in art, like the very simple, like thinking of that instead of like a minimalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder for you if there's a kind of sense of an importance to like the small gestures that come, right? And I first thought it when I had looked at the stuff, and then I looked at your merch work that you do, and like the small gesture of like a hat with something on it.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who are just listening live, we're both wearing hats, so it makes it funnier. But yeah, just is there something about like a small gesture for you that is important?
Oh yeah, I mean, I believe in. I love the small gesture. I think it's sometimes I was like I had this brief moment where I mean it's probably still going on, but there was a real concentrated moment of sort of like this obsession with like what is the smallest version of like a remix.
Yeah.
And so one that I made that was like I don't know. I mean, I didn't even know what it was for, but it was like taking that Miley Cyrus song "Wrecking Ball," and I had this feeling that the pause should just be like a third of a second longer right before the wrecking ball happens. And I was just like, I think it's because on the radio it's not supposed to be too long, but it just needs to be like a little longer. And so I like went into Audacity, made it like what I thought was like just right, and like played something, and they were like, like what like you like this song? And being like, no, it's like now. And anyways, so not that was a piece that's going to show up by any means or something like that, but I do think there's something interesting about just like what is the smallest gesture can sometimes be the most impactful version of that, like the shifting the gaze of something by like 2 degrees instead of turning the painting upside down, just like shifting the look a little bit. It's like that. And then also, and I think part of that also is about the like with like all the merch stuff, the hats and the stickers and everything like that, like, there's ones that have more moves and ones that have fewer ones, and sometimes there's something about the discreteness of the container that allows for a small thing to be enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's like I love that exact thing. And also there's a way that can sometimes like through then there being a closer level of legibility towards the original thing, that gesture can be revealed more easily. Yeah, so just say like if someone has a thing in mind and they can see like the way that it's different, a small amount is different than it being completely different, and then like or kind of like opaque in its relationship to the original material or object.
Yeah.
I think can be really powerful. And I also like I think there's something in the small gesture like I'm also I don't know like the ways that also like the details become so interesting with any kind of work, and that sometimes that is about towards a sort of like I don't know, adding that like a small level of imperfection inside of it, which feels like that's like the gesture is sort of like the humanness inside of like that little thing that can sort of like shift it, and that can open up sort of the feeling for somebody experiencing it, I think, to understand that humanness. But it also like it reveals both like a level of control and lack of control, which I think is interesting, and that's different from something that feels extremely fine in its presentation, where there's something about like offering a way into the thinking that happened by having one little thing in there that feels like it's working at cross purposes, or is throwing out the new thing, or feels like it's like an ellipsis instead of a period in terms of like where the next thing could lead or something.
Yeah, that moment when you first start making art and you have that, you do something small and it becomes almost like the most impactful thing for somebody. It's such a good feeling.
Totally.
And I think it's so easy to lose that, but there is, and it gets confused, I think, with a certain kind of like corporate minimalism or like a kind of the whitewashed art historical minimalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, there's something really beautiful about just kind of, right, the small gesture, and it's a kind of minimalistic gesture, is being on a walk with somebody and being like, look at this flower I found.
Yeah.
It's like the most magical thing that's ever happened.
Totally. And I think also there's something, I mean, just speaking to that sort of idea of like the art historical approach, or the way that functions, is that I think there's so many kinds of works that, especially inside of like a kind of conceptual, structural, and minimalist framework, where you experience it first of all as like a JPEG, as a masterpiece, and as sort of like the articulation of the idea, as opposed to then when you get to see certain things in real space, or get to experience what they actually look like, and how it's like there are other things happening inside of there, and that was a part of it, and not that it was like a sort of necessarily like a fetishistic move about whatever the thing is that is revealed, but the ways that all of a sudden like it feels really different once you're, I don't know, I mean, for me a big part of that was like with sort of some of the I don't know, like heavy hitters of kind of like conceptual and structural experimental film of the 70s, but it's like when you see wavelength, which can be described in 1 minute, which is just like a zoom into a building, or it's like in a loft, and then it's a 45-minute long zoom, and it just like feels continuous. The way it's described feels like mechanical or something like that. And then to actually see it, it's like the film stock changes, something happens inside of it, the sound gets really intense, the degradation of the film stock is inside of there, but also like that the room is a room that is a wall that has stuff on it, and the texture of that, and all of a sudden it's a much more interesting thing than just the single idea.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's like a thing that all people desire, and also like, and if you watch it first as like a degraded bootleg on YouTube, it's like that wasn't really. I mean, it's still interesting, but it's like to see that as it's meant to be presented, you get to like see the way that there's like all these other thoughts that are happening inside of it. It wasn't like for 1 year Michael Snow just like pressed on the zoom button, or I guess he was like doing this, but it's like no, there's like all these other things that are happening inside of there, and those feel like some of the small gestures that can kind of like get in the way of that sort of sense. And also the idea that these things, like again, is sort of pushing back on some of the masterpiece oriented art history thinking, is this also generally conceived of as being inside of a practice, inside of a flow, and that leads to the next thing, and this person didn't know this was going to be the one that they would be showing 50 years later, and the one right after them before also have things inside of them, and it's part of like an ongoing conversation that's happening. Yeah
Absolutely. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, so we're gonna hit this as we can. But so the first thing, and this is something I want to do because I think it's like the great conversation, but then something kind of a little funnier, a little bit spicier maybe, is what is it's just, it's a simple question. It's what is your hot take about the art world that maybe not so spicy that you'd feel uncomfortable having it broadcast, but like that you think could
and like
discourse
the Subway Takes version.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess I think that a hot take is that maybe it's not a hot take, but it's something that I think about often. Is just sort of like the importance of the space for play inside of different kinds of things, and that there is sometimes like a sort of small confidence that's required for that to feel like this is not the last show. Like that, it's so unlikely that I'll do such a bad job that I never get to do something again. And so then, what are the ways that can become something that is more opened up? And I think that is both pleasurable for the people involved in it. It can kind of like remove some of the self-seriousness. It also, I think, can be there's like a generosity towards an audience member to have this sense that there is like a joy inside of there. I think often about sort of like, especially, I mean, I don't make any money off of my art. I don't think that you do yet. I think a lot of the people are listening are not yet. And so then insofar as like that, which is possible for some people, is kind of removed as a goal, then it's sort of like, okay, if there's not money and there's not glory, then it's like, what is it that we're doing here? And it's like, how do you build the thing that you want given that context and create the spaces that you're interested in? Like it's the way that it's like, it's not a rehearsal. This is life. This is your life. Make it the thing you want it to be, but that it can be playful and interesting and enjoyable, and that it should also be like providing people with some of that nourishment that comes from a sort of like genuine good faith approach to making something that, I don't know, can be interesting, and that's part of the conversation. Yeah. And so definitely not a hot take. That's actually like very like inspiring instead of like.
That's kind of going to be what happens. But yeah, and it's, the exhibition as a space for realizing what the work needs to do. But
yeah.
And then I wanted to ask, is there advice you would give to, like, one piece of advice that you think is important for current art students, whether they be undergrad or grad, to just like know or think about, especially maybe the younger students?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, like, build community, the people that you are in conversation with now, potentially people you'll be doing things with for the rest of your life. And that's really exciting. And that's part of the joy of the whole thing. Build sort of like resiliencies, and don't become too dependent on institutions. And it's like good to make use of the things that are available. You should be taking advantage of all the things, especially at SAC, that like great facilities. But I think it's important to not insist that your work demands a $20,000 piece of equipment to make.
Yeah.
And then maybe the thing that's maybe more, I don't know, important inside of there is just sort of like to open yourself up to what your practice can become. I think there can be like a sort of a tendency towards a pre-professionalization of my work, XXX. And what that means is that you become, like you're making shoes, and then all of a sudden it's like, what is the point of an artist if you're not allowing yourself to be like, or maybe I'm making music today, or maybe I'm doing something else. And that's sort of like again, not towards a dilettantism, but towards something that allows that you, anytime you're making a statement about your work, that should be something that allows you a space for reflection, and you can also contravene that and contradict that and move into a place where like allow your curiosity to move you in different places while centering joy and exploration in what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely taking advantage of resources, like, for example, Free Radio SAIC.
Yeah, right.
I'm sure they're going to love that I'm plugging them and being like, you're still looking for radio shows.
I mean, to have the capacity to have a radio show just because you're like, it's amazing.
My undergrad didn't have this. Yeah, and then is there anything you'd like to plug?
Yes, you're hearing it here first, okay, y'all. Breaking news. Western Pole, which is a project that has been going on for 10 years, is having a 10-year anniversary, not retrospective, but celebration exhibition that'll be opening on November 8th and running through December 6th at Patient Info Gallery, which is a great gallery that is an artist-run space that is run out of the artist, Brian Jukas's father's old dermatology practice. It's truly one of my favorite spaces in town. And also is it's at 902 North Western Avenue, and is the address that I used for the first Western Pole for 4 years when it was right near there. And I just was like, I mean, this is the corner, I guess it's 902. And so that was actually how we first met, was he like looked up the address and was like, I'm sorry, what? There's a gallery here? And you're like, wait, but it's like a pole? But, but so that's going to be great. There's a bunch of different artists that are going to be involved in that publication, performance, and then also things are going to be happening off-site and a lot of sort of surprises. And so I'm very excited about that. And that's like that's dominating my mind right now.
Amazing. Well, Jesse, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Evan.
Thank you all for listening. This happens every Thursday. I can't wait to keep doing this.
Yeah, I'll be listening.
Amazing. All right.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.